The British Iron Age is a conventional name used in the archaeology of Great Britain, referring to the prehistoric and protohistoric phases of the Iron Age culture of the main island and the smaller islands, typically excluding prehistoric Ireland, which had an independent Iron Age culture of its own. The parallel phase of Irish archaeology is termed the Irish Iron Age. The Iron Age is not an archaeological horizon of common artifacts, but is rather a locally diverse cultural phase. The British Iron Age lasted in theory from the first significant use of iron for tools and weapons in Britain to the Romanization of the southern half of the island. The Romanized culture is termed Roman Britain and is considered to supplant the British Iron Age. The Irish Iron Age was ended by the rise of Christianity. While the tribes populating the island are often and especially popularly considered to have belonged to a broadly Celtic culture, or sometimes an insular Celtic subgroup, in recent years the usefulness of this label has become a matter of controversy. At a minimum, Celtic is a linguistic term without an implication of a lasting cultural unity connecting Gaul with the British Isles throughout the Iron Age. The Brythonic languages spoken in Britain at this time, as well as others including the Goidelic and Gaulish languages of neighbouring Ireland and Gaul respectively, certainly belong to the group known as Celtic languages. However, it cannot be assumed that particular cultural features found in one Celtic-speaking culture can be extrapolated to the others. Periodization. At present, over 100 large-scale excavations of Iron Age sites have taken place, dating from the 8th century BC to the 1st century AD, and overlapping into the Bronze Age in the 8th century BC. Hundreds of radiocarbon dates have been acquired and have been calibrated on 4 different curves, the most precise being based on tree ring sequences. The following scheme summarizes a comparative chart presented in a 2005 book by Barry Cunliffe, but it should be noted that British artifacts were much later in adopting continental styles such as the Latin style of Celtic art. The end of the Iron Age extends into the very early Roman Empire under the theory that Romanization required some time to effect. In parts of Britain that were not Romanized, such as Scotland, the period is extended a little longer, say to the 5th century. The geographer closest to AD 100 is perhaps Ptolemy. Pliny and Strabo are a bit older, but Ptolemy gives the most detail. Archaeological evidence. Attempts to understand the human behavior of the period have traditionally focused on the geographic position of the islands and their landscape, along with the channels of influence coming from continental Europe. During the later Bronze Age there are indications of new ideas influencing land use and settlement. Extensive field systems, now called Celtic fields, were being set out and settlements were becoming more permanent and focused on better exploitation of the land. The central organization to undertake this had been present since the Neolithic period, but it was now targeted at economic and social goals, such as taming the landscape rather than the building of large ceremonial structures like Stonehenge. Long ditches, some many miles in length, were dug with enclosures placed at their ends. These are thought to indicate territorial borders and a desire to increase control over wide areas. By the 8th century BC, there is increasing evidence of Great Britain becoming closely tied to continental Europe, especially in Britain's south and east. New weapon types appeared with clear parallels to those on the continent, such as the carped tongue sword, complex examples of which are found all over Atlantic Europe. Phoenician traders probably began visiting Great Britain in search of minerals around this time, bringing with them goods from the Mediterranean. At the same time, northern European artifact types reached eastern Great Britain in large quantities from across the North Sea. Within this context, the climate became considerably wetter, forcing Bronze Age farmsteads that had grown on lowland areas to relocate to upland sites. Defensive structures dating from this time are often impressive, for example the Brocks of northern Scotland and the hill forts that dotted the rest of the islands. Some of the most well-known hill forts include Maiden Castle, Dorset, Cadbury Castle, Somerset and Danebury, Hampshire. Hill forts first appeared in Wessex in the late Bronze Age, but only become common in the period between 550 and 400 BC. The earliest were of a simple univalate form, and often connected with earlier enclosures attached to the long ditch systems. Few hill forts have been substantially excavated in the modern era, Danebury being a notable exception, with 49% of its total surface area studied. However, it appears that these forts were also used for domestic purposes, with examples of food storage, industry and occupation being found within their earthworks. On the other hand, they may have been only occupied intermittently, as it is difficult to reconcile permanently occupied hill forts with the lowland farmsteads and their roundhouses found during the 20th century, such as at Little Woodbury and Raspain Camp. Many hill forts are not in fact forts at all, and demonstrate little or no evidence of occupation. The development of hill forts may have occurred due to greater tensions that arose between the better structured and more populous social groups. Alternatively, there are suggestions that, in the latter phases of the Iron Age, these structures simply indicate a greater accumulation of wealth and a higher standard of living, although any such shift is invisible in the archaeological record for the Middle Iron Age, when hill forts come into their own. In this regard, they may have served as wider centers used for markets and social contact. Either way, during the Roman occupation the evidence suggests that, as defensive structures, they proved to be of little use against concerted Roman attack. Suetonius comments that Vespasian captured more than 20 towns during a campaign in the West Country in 43 AD, and there is some evidence of violence from the hill forts of Hod Hill and Maiden Castle in Dorset from this period. Some hill forts continued as settlements for the newly conquered Britons. Some were also reused by later cultures, such as the Saxons, in the early medieval period. The people of Iron Age Britain. Celtic movement from the continent. The Roman historian Tacitus suggested that the Britons were descended from people who had arrived from the continent. Comparing the Caledonians to their Germanic neighbours, the Silures of southern Wales to Iberian settlers, and the inhabitants of southeast Britannia to Gaulish tribes. This migrationist view long informed later views of the origins of the British Iron Age and, indeed, the making of the modern nations. Linguistic evidence inferred from the surviving Celtic languages in northern and western Great Britain at first appeared to support this idea, and the changes in material culture which archaeologists observed during later prehistory were routinely ascribed to a new wave of invaders. From the early 20th century, this invasionist scenario was juxtaposed to a diffusionist view. By the 1960s, this latter model seemed to have gained mainstream support, but it came in turn under attack in the 1970s. There was certainly a large migration of people from Central Europe westwards during the early Iron Age. There are examples of events which could be labelled invasions, such as the arrival in southern Britain of the Belgae from the end of the 2nd century BC as described in Caesar's commentaries on the Gallic War. Although such sudden events may be invisible in the archaeological record, principally depending, in this case, on the interpretation of Aylesford Swirling pottery. Regardless of the invasionist versus diffusionist debate, it is beyond dispute that exchanges with the continent were a defining aspect of the British Iron Age. According to Julius Caesar, the Britons further inland than the Belgae believed that they were indigenous. Demography, population estimates vary, but the number of people in Iron Age Great Britain could have been 3 or 4 million by the 1st century BC, with most concentrated densely in the agricultural lands of the south. Settlement density and a land shortage may have contributed to rising tensions during the period. The population pyramid for Iron Age Britain would have been a classic pyramid in shape, with no significant number of people older than 50 years. The average life expectancy at birth would have been around 25, but at the age of 5 it would have been around 30. These figures would be slightly lower for women, and slightly higher for men throughout the Middle Iron Age in most areas. On account of the high mortality rate of young women during childbirth, however, the average age for the two sexes would be roughly equal for the Late Iron Age. This interpretation depends on the view that warfare and social strife increased in the Late Iron Age, which seems to be fairly well attested in the archaeological record, for southern Britain at least. Early in the Iron Age, the widespread Wessex pottery of southern Britain, such as the type style from All Canning's Cross, may suggest a consolidated socio-economic group in the region. However, by 600 BC this appears to have broken down into differing subgroups with their own pottery styles. Between c. 400 and 100 BC there is evidence of emerging regional identities and a significant population increase. Ptolemies Albion. Claudius Ptolemy described Britain at the beginning of Roman rule but incorporated material from earlier sources. Although the name of Britannic Isles had been known since the voyage of Pytheas and Britannia was in use by Strabo and Pliny, Ptolemy used the earlier Albion, known to have been used as early as the Massaliote Periplus. For more details on Iron Age peoples of Britain, see Iron Age tribes in Britain, list of Celtic tribes. Iron Age beliefs in Britain. The Romans described a variety of deities worshipped by the people of northwestern Europe. Barry Cunliffe perceives a division between one group of gods relating to masculinity, the sky and individual tribes, and a second group of goddesses relating to associations with fertility, the earth, and a universality that transcended tribal differences. Wells and springs had female, divine links exemplified by the goddess Sullus worshipped at Bath. In Tacitus Agricola, he notes the similarity between both religious and ritual practices of the pre-Roman British and the Gauls. Religious practices revolved around offerings and sacrifices, sometimes human but more often involving the ritual slaughter of animals or the deposition of metalwork, especially war booty. Weapons and horse trappings have been found in the bog at Lyncarrig Bark on Anglesey and are interpreted as votive offerings cast into a lake. Numerous weapons have also been recovered from rivers, especially the Thames, but also the Trent and Tyne. Some buried hoards of jewelry are interpreted as gifts to the earth gods. Disused grain storage pits and the ends of ditches have also produced what appear to be deliberately placed deposits, including a preference for burials of horses, dogs, and ravens. The bodies were often mutilated, and some human finds at the bottom of pits, such as those found at Danebury, may have had a ritual aspect. Caesar's texts tell us that the priests of Britain were Druids, a religious elite with considerable holy and secular powers. Great Britain appears to have been the seat of the Druidic religion, and Tacitus' account of the later raid on Anglesey led by Suetonius Paulinus gives some indication of its nature. No archaeological evidence survives of Druidry, although a number of burials made with ritual trappings and found in Kent may suggest a religious character to the subjects. Overall, the traditional view is that religion was practiced in natural settings in the open air. However, several sites interpreted as Iron Age shrines seem to contradict this view, which may derive from Victorian and later Celtic Romanticism. Sites such as at Hayling Island in Hampshire and that found during construction work at Heathrow Airport are interpreted as purpose-built shrines. The Hayling Island example was a circular wooden building set within a rectangular precinct and was rebuilt in stone as a Romano-British temple in the 1st century AD to the same plan. The Heathrow Temple was a small cellar surrounded by a ring of post holes thought to have formed an ambulatory, which is very similar to Romano-Celtic temples found elsewhere in Europe. A rectangular structure at Danebury and a sequence of 6 poster structures overlooking calf burials and culminating in a trench-founded rectangular structure at Cadbury Castle. Somerset, have been similarly interpreted. An example at Sigwells, overlooking Cadbury Castle, was associated with metalwork in whole and partial animal burials to its east. However, evidence of an open-air shrine was found at Haledon, Leicestershire. Here, a collection of objects known as the Haledon Treasure were buried in a ditch in the early 1st century AD. The only structural evidence was a wooden palisade built in the ditch. Death in Iron Age Great Britain seems to have produced different behaviours in different regions. Cremation was a common method of disposing of the dead, although the chariot burials and other inhumations of the Arras culture of East Yorkshire, and the cist burials of Cornwall, demonstrate that it was not ubiquitous. In fact, the general dearth of excavated Iron Age burials makes drawing conclusions difficult. Excarnation has been suggested as a reason for the lack of burial evidence, with the remains of the dead being dispersed either naturally or through human agency.